My parents told my brother he could have my house and that I could just live in a trailer in the backyard because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. Part 1. I'll warn everyone here that this is going to be very long, so long that I'm going to split it into 2 posts and include a summary at the end of each. I really don't care who believes this. It's so crazy that I don't blame anyone who thinks it's fake. I'm not going to argue about it, but this happened to me. I also don't care if anyone in my family reads this. I'm not going to warn them, but I'm also not going to reveal details that could identify me. For those who don't know me, I'm a single man in my 30s. I have a brother who's 29 and already has 4 kids. He had the first at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born a few months ago. My sister-in-law and I don't get along. She always likes to needle me, acting superior, then plays the extreme dramatic victim if I push back in any way. She can start crying on cue and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from almost anyone. My parents and my brother adore her, even though they know how she really is, and they simply don't care. She's very pretty, I admit. But she's so rotten on the inside I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get a job, even though she has a university degree, and my mom helps with the kids all day. So their finances rely entirely on my brother. That also means they can't afford anywhere but my parents' house, and privacy is an issue with all of them living together in a 3-bedroom house built in the 60s. As a kid, my younger brother was obviously the favorite. We're 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was punished harshly if I ever pushed back against his antics. Back then it was obvious my parents cared much more about him because he always got the bigger share of everything, unless someone called them out, which happened a lot from other family members. Because of that, my parents moved us about 250 kilometers away, where we'd normally only see the rest of the family on holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. My brother even got physically aggressive with me on several occasions, relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to get over it whenever I got upset. I only got treated equally when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I'll confess it was funny watching their faces when they had to treat me the same as my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had very nosy, gossip-loving relatives, so my parents did their best to hide what was really happening and threatened to take all my stuff if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, that only made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out, because it meant they didn't have to support me anymore. I hadn't even finished high school when I left home, but crashing at friends' places was much better than living with them. I reduced contact with them a lot after I left. They didn't even show up to my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on I generally only saw my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. The start of the pandemic in 2020 wasn't kind to me. I lost my job. I couldn't renew my apartment lease because my roommate also lost his job and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment. It was a 2-bedroom rental that I really loved. When the lease was ending, my roommate left early to live with relatives, and I had to sell almost all my things because I'd soon be homeless if I didn't downsize to the max. I really shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I liked living well, until life stopped being kind to me. It took me a while to realize I should have lived somewhere cheaper to save more for hard times. But I had a plan. I had a pickup truck simply because I've always loved pickups. So I found a camper trailer in good condition for $X000, omitted here, and mounted it on the truck to live in for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in the camper far longer than I imagined. I originally hoped to live in the trailer at my parents' place, where my brother and his family still lived. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they said the house was full and they didn't want me there. Also, we hadn't exactly gotten along over the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my truck there if I paid basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too expensive just to park my truck. I was unemployed and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as possible until I found a new job. At that price I might as well have been renting an apartment. My parents called my truck an ugly eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law found it hilarious that I had to live in a trailer. My brother joined in, pointing and mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck in a store parking lot to sleep the first night when I had nowhere else to go. I was terrified, afraid someone would try to break in. Let's just say I didn't sleep well that night. I had nowhere to go, since the relatives who owned homes lived pretty far away, all my friends lived in apartments, and I was very tied to my area. I didn't want to just leave. I'd also forwarded my mail to a friend's apartment. It was the only way to still receive my correspondence. Finding a stable place to park was really hard. I went looking for a job similar to my old one. I spent months living this nomad camper life. In that period, I had to deal with a lot, from panhandlers and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my trailer was ugly. At one point, someone who told me to get out claimed to be from the HOA, even though I wasn't parked on a street with houses. When I asked which HOA, they got very aggressive and threatened me. Even so, I moved the camper just to avoid trouble. To have a constant source of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to connect to any exterior outlet on a building while parked on the street. I know it isn't right, but I had to keep my batteries charged to keep the fridge running. I had a small solar battery to recharge my phone, but I didn't have a generator, and generators are noisy and need fuel anyway, so I did what I needed to do. After months of living like that, I finally got a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find something that wasn't retail. I'd worked retail during college and swore I'd never do it again, though I was close to breaking that promise. I was still getting unemployment money but didn't have a stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to stay unemployed until the money ran out. Plus, I was bored. I had little to do besides read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and map out where I could park and which local public restrooms I could use. I'm a bit jealous of the Japanese with their public bathhouses. We really need things like that here. When I finally got the new job, I basically lived in the back parking lot near the warehouse, in old staff spots that seemed forgotten. My boss, the owner, liked the arrangement because I was available to work any shift I could pick up, as long as I'd slept enough. He even let me take the camper off the truck and set it up in one of the spots so I could drive without it. I'm not sure how legal that was, but no one bothered us the whole time I was there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, there were a few, but security removed them. I was on call pretty much all the time, and whenever they needed me, I worked, basically every day of the week. My boss let me hook my trailer up to the building for electricity and water, and I paid a small rent by working Sundays for free when only the janitor and security were in the office. I usually showered at a friend's apartment or the local gym, since the trailer didn't have a shower, only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty task. So I used other bathrooms whenever I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the restroom at any time. I even became friends with the night security guard, he became one of my closest friends. The trailer was easy to heat in winter with a small electric heater. Summers weren't fun, the trailer had no AC, so I bought a used portable AC just to make it more bearable. I made a lot in overtime and learned some new skills hands-on from other employees. In the middle of this year, I got a better position at the company as a supervisor and started making more than at my previous job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I had after losing my apartment made me realize I needed something much more stable in the long term. I looked for something near my work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small lot just 3 kilometers away. I got it for under asking somehow. I used almost all my savings as a down payment and was approved for a mortgage. Finally, I didn't need to live in the trailer anymore. There was enough space behind the house to back in my truck and set the trailer up in the yard, so I put it there as a kind of small outbuilding in case I wanted to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I made the foolish mistake of sharing it on my Facebook profile. My family saw the post, and that's where this whole mess started. A few weeks later, my parents, my brother, and his family showed up unannounced to tour my house. I hadn't even given them my address. How they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends admitted it, and no family members had visited before that. So I imagine they followed me from work to home. My brother Dan said the house was too big for me alone and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with their 4th child and my house is much closer to his work. He pointed out that I already had the trailer, so I could just live in it outside while they lived in the main house. And let me make it clear, Dan never even mentioned paying rent, even though he has a decent job. He also started talking about rules and even curfews, and that I couldn't just come in any time without notice. If he weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to was insane. But Dan lost his mind long ago thanks to our parents treating him like the center of the universe. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no right to an opinion. There was no way in hell I was renting my house or parts of it to him. Maybe to other people to help pay the mortgage more easily, sure. But certainly not to him or his awful wife. I'd seen this same situation in online videos many times and never thought I'd actually live it because it seemed so absurd. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law fit the description of a bunch of narcissistic, spoiled crazies. So I took out my phone and set it to record, then just held it. Dan didn't seem to care, or didn't notice, and kept ranting with his arms waving, listing all the reasons he needed my house. Then he acted like it was already decided and tried to extend his hand to seal the deal. That's when I finally put my foot down. I said no, loud enough that Dan actually backed off for a moment. I rarely raised my voice to him like that because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. I can do whatever I want here. I stood up and told him my house was not available to be taken. Acting like I'd let him move in just because they wanted it wasn't going to make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it wasn't my fault he kept having more kids and had to live with our parents because he couldn't afford a place of his own. Dan got as close to me as possible without actually touching and said I didn't deserve the house, that he needed a better place for his family. I laughed in his face and said that was complete BS because I worked hard to buy my house, of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I didn't have a wife or kids and didn't need all that space, so I might as well give the house to him. I said I wasn't giving him anything, and he hadn't even offered to pay rent if I let him move in. I'd be covering my entire mortgage alone without being able to live in my own home. Then Dan told me he shouldn't have to pay rent because family comes first, and our parents said I would do it, like their word was law or something. I told Dan they had neither the right nor the power to give my house to him. Right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law burst back in through the front door and surrounded me to try to force my agreement. There was a lot of arguing, but to summarize, from that point on I heard the phrase, "do this for Dan," more times than I can count. I told them they had no say in my life or my house and asked them to leave before I called the police. My sister-in-law screamed at me louder, saying she was pregnant again and I couldn't do this to her. I said I hadn't done anything to her, she just assumed she could take from me as if I'd allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. I called her an arrogant person who never had any respect for me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has, she's not living in my house. That set her off enough to physically attack me. She managed to hit me in the face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back while she kicked and screamed, demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone in my hand captured practically everything. I stood up and said I'd call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan they were going. My mother said I had 1 week to reconsider. I told her I wouldn't and not to come back. Then I told my sister-in-law my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything I'd sue her for assault. She screamed at me and left, crying loudly with her hands over her face. My mom was the last out the door and said I should do this for Dan and my sister-in-law. I replied that I would not. My parents told my brother he could have my house and I could just live in a trailer in the backyard because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. Part 2. As I mentioned in the first half of my post, many will find this unbelievable and long. I don't blame anyone who says it's fake, I'd probably say the same if I were reading it. But as you saw in my first post, you know how problematic my parents are. In my life, they were the root of all evil that spoiled my brother into the jerk he is today. They never once gave me a real reason for it, and I kind of fear there isn't one. Some people can't explain why they make choices like blatant favoritism, so all they can do is keep backing the child they favored. That's exactly what my parents tried to do, and I pretty much wrecked their lives because of it. Not legally, but emotionally. After I kicked out my parents, brother, and sister-in-law for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went on social media and told the whole family what happened. It spread fast, but you won't find it now because everything's been deleted for a while and I set my profile to private. I posted because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist events to make me the villain. I was exactly right. But I had about an hour head start and had video evidence to back my story about what they did. No, I don't intend to show the video here, so don't ask. Being proactive worked because I got a good number of family members on my side right away. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law must have been ready to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. They had a few suck-ups supporting them, but not many more. Plenty already knew how entitled they were, so what happened was something everyone understood, and quickly. There was one person in particular who called me, I don't know who, but they cursed me out on the phone, saying I was a horrible brother and needed to make way for a real head of the family. I hung up and blocked the number. It didn't happen again. A week passed, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front door, exactly like they said they would in their previous ultimatum. They rang the bell like crazy and banged on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to wedge themselves in again. But I'd installed a pair of chains that prevented that, and I leaned on the door as an extra measure. My dad and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on video and would call the police if they tried forcing their way in again. My mom calmed them down and, in her fakest sweet voice, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her, and the rest of them, to F off and never come back. My mom fake cried and asked why I couldn't just do it for Dan, because he's my dear brother. I laughed, then bluntly said I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years, and they encouraged it. They're lousy parents, and he's a lousy brother. So I told them to leave or I'd call the police immediately. They left surprisingly easily, except for my mother's loud crying and the dirty looks from the others. Getting them out was strangely easy. I thought the mess was over, but I should have taken them more seriously because they had another stupid plan. I came home later that week, Friday night, and found a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were moving their stuff in. He just waved at me with a smug smile when he saw me. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop, but my sister-in-law smirked and told me with disdain that whether I liked it or not they were moving in, and then, in the fakest way possible, tilted her head and pouted her lips to say it was fine because my mother gave permission, and I should always do what my mother says. Hearing those words and seeing that superior face made my blood boil. I locked myself in my car and called the police immediately. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started banging on my window and yelling for me to stop, saying I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed the house, then cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I replied, "It's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all heard by the dispatcher because the window was slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. She was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan and my sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I told the officers what happened and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. When we went to my front door, I saw they'd changed the lock. The old lock was on the porch with its core drilled out, and the drill they used was next to it with a brand new bit set. They couldn't have been more stupid, leaving evidence like that. I pointed out the broken lock and the drill, then gave the officers a rundown of all previous events. I think Dan called our parents after I got home because they showed up while I was talking to the police. My parents immediately lied, saying I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. Dan and my sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They were super convinced, as if they'd somehow tricked me. In reality, they'd made and printed a fake lease. But my signature wasn't on it. There was a signature, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them had ever even seen my signature in their lives. Incredibly stupid. I told my parents and Dan that this was blatant fraud, and if the police investigated, they'd figure that out easily. I didn't think jail or court would be good for them. It could even make Dan lose his job, the only means he has to support his family. I also said I'd hire a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call Child Protective Services to make sure the kids were safe. Dan turned pale and looked genuinely scared when I said all that. But my mom stood between us and kept going on about how I should just do this for Dan, and live in the damn trailer so they could finally have a home of their own. I yelled that if she thought it was such a great idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let him have her house. The officers separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all gone immediately or I'd press charges. I shouted about how they'd drilled out my front door lock to get in, the police papers were obvious forgeries, they'd forged my signature terribly, and I had video of my sister-in-law assaulting me, crimes with which I could ruin their lives if I wanted. And if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was because of Dan's kids. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mom gave in and said she'd put a stop to it. She went to my sister-in-law and spoke to her quietly for a minute while my dad talked to Dan. My sister-in-law instantly started bawling and ripped the fake lease papers into tiny pieces, tossing them on the ground like confetti, only for an officer to order them to pick up the paper or get fined for littering. At this point, both officers had, "I'm not paid enough for this," looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to put their things back on the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the oldest was sobbing that he wouldn't have his own room now. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids to make one last pathetic attempt to guilt-trip me with a sad family tableau. You know when everyone bunches up in a kind of group hug, all staring in the same direction? I swear they'd rehearsed it. All the kids had the same pleading look, lips trembling. My sister-in-law kept stroking her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother made the saddest face he could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to live here." I didn't budge and told them to keep packing. The kids and my sister-in-law cranked the crying to max, and Dan shouted at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help family. I laughed like a maniac and shot back that what he was trying to do was take, not share, and no amount of crying would make me let his family move in. He's not my brother anymore, just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, just like when we were kids. Dan started cursing until the officers told him to cool off or get cuffed regardless of whether I wanted to press charges. He clamped his mouth shut, looking like a mix of fear and supreme rage. I asked the officers if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left, and they said they had no intention of going anywhere until it was resolved. In the next few minutes, 2 officers became 4 as more arrived, for whatever reason. That gave my parents extra incentive to leave. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door, though I got another lock the next day because I didn't know if he'd made copies. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Instead of handing them to me, he threw them down the street into a storm drain, telling me to go get them myself. One of the officers reprimanded him and made him retrieve the keys. He had to remove the grate to reach them and got pretty dirty doing it. When he got them back, he just grumbled and tossed them into my hand. Then I told all of them to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat. I said, dripping with sarcasm, "Oh no, that means I won't get to go to any of your parties where I'm always treated badly anyway because Dan has obviously always been the favorite." I told them they treated me so badly as a kid that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do what you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you, swallow it. My parents were shocked after I said all that, and the 4 officers also looked pretty judgmental toward them. Pro tip, if you want to put bad parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of police, they probably won't try anything really stupid. My mom started crying and walked off. My dad just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me. Dan held his kids, defeated. Oh, and my sister-in-law was throwing a tantrum on my lawn. Soon they lined up, passing boxes and taking their things out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all came out quickly. But while they did that, my mom kept saying it wasn't too late and I could still do this for Dan, trying to bargain more and more to change my mind. She said Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan have my house so I wouldn't have to share a roof with him. I told her to shut up and keep packing because I didn't want Dan or his family around, I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want to live with him or my parents ever again, not after how they treated me as a child. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. My sister-in-law had another tantrum after hearing that, threw a box on the ground, then sat down to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat there angry and sulking until everyone else finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out and loaded onto the truck. Before they left, I unloaded on my parents one more time about everything they put me through growing up, and with 4 officers present, they couldn't do much but stand there and listen, at least this time. I confronted them about so many things and even pointed out how they couldn't do a single kind thing for me like letting me keep my trailer at their place when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and my sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to push me out of my own house so Dan could live there for free, but when I needed a place to stay, they wanted to exploit me by charging more than I could afford just to park my truck, even knowing I was unemployed. The officers shot them more extremely judgmental looks when I said all that. Then I cornered my parents again and asked what I'd done, besides being born, to deserve such bad treatment. Why, when I finally had a little success in life, did they want to take it away to give to their golden child, since they prefer I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself? I bought my house with money I earned. I owe them nothing. I will never ask them for anything again, because it's clear I'll never be anything but a doormat or a cash source in their eyes. They had no answers, just stood there, mouths open like fish out of water. I went on and asked what on earth made them think they were good parents after all that. My dad was red as a pepper, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mom was crying, saying I was a horrible person. I directly agreed that she is a horrible person. They all are. And I bet they'll go to hell for it, too. They were awful people and everyone knew it, but if I had confronted all of this in private instead of public, they would have gotten mad at me and still acted like I was wrong. They maintained denial so long that it became part of who they are. My mom hid her face in my dad's jacket to cry, and my dad looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely while they finished loading the truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen, not that I had much furniture yet. I was lucky to have a couch at the time. They all went back to their vehicles, and my sister-in-law stared at me with malice until my brother finally made her drive the minivan home. As soon as they were gone, I went back online and told everyone what had happened. My parents were so embarrassed they didn't even try to defend their actions this time. While the family had been somewhat divided before that incident, now it was an avalanche in my favor. Almost the entire family took my side after this, and those who didn't simply stayed neutral. No matter how much my parents tried the "we did it for Dan" line, nobody was listening anymore. Any remaining family support they had is now gone. Many in the family whom I didn't expect to side with me did, including their former suck-ups. I guess they finally had enough. Around that time I offered to host half the family on Christmas Eve at my new house. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brothers and sister-in-law's profiles. I saw She-Ha. Part 3, my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law showed up at my house on Christmas when they knew they weren't welcome. I was trying to keep everything in 2 posts, but when I compiled it all, I realized part 2 was simply too long, so I divided it into 3. For those who mass commented that I should get cameras, I'll buy them as soon as I can. I'm still financially recovering from buying my house last year, and as far as I know, good cameras need a decent computer to record, and all I have is a 3-year-old laptop with Windows 10. Yes, I know about doorbell cameras, those will be the first I buy. For those insisting I should have had my brother and sister-in-law arrested, the only reason I didn't was because their parents. Their kids need them, and if Dan went to jail, he'd likely lose his job, and then the family would have no money. His wife has a baby just a few months old now. None of them deserve to end up in jail. But you don't need jail to get revenge. The police can help, sure, but I got my revenge without filing charges. Will I be that merciful again? Probably not. And they know it. I decided to wait until after New Year's to create an account and post again, just in case more things happened. And they did. As previous readers know, my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts on social media clearly aimed at me, especially after she had her 4th baby in November. She kept spewing the same nonsense in slightly reworded ways, basically repeating that she was tired of living with my parents, there wasn't enough space, she needed her own house, blah blah blah. I know I sound dismissive, but if you live through what I have with these people, you'd be ready to play sad violins for them too. They're just that bad. And since I waited until January to create an account, more things happened, exactly as I predicted. As I mentioned before, I invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house. Everyone showed up, even though it was a 3 to 4 hour drive for them. They wanted to come and show support. They praised me for working hard to buy a house on my own and apologized for everything I'd been through. They asked why I hadn't just taken my trailer and driven 3 hours to live near them instead of being practically homeless for so long. I had to admit, I was too attached to living here, and my best job opportunities were in this area. My hometown didn't have many, if any, in my field. I wanted to carve my own path as much as possible. They accepted that answer. Overall, we had a very nice party, the best I'd been to in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and my uncle's Ray Charles album was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else. It was a wonderful, happy moment. For the first time in ages, I could forget past problems and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, guess who showed up? My parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law. They all walked in trying to look cheerful and friendly. They didn't even knock, just came in the front door like they were welcome. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they'd brought gifts. One of my uncles jumped up and shouted at them before I could say anything else. He said they didn't deserve to be in my house or my life after what they tried months before. Several other relatives backed him up. For context, that uncle is my mother's brother, and he used to love her until he learned what happened between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mom's parents, who are quite old now, quickly stepped between us and told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile with me, it was too soon. They'd never been so disappointed in them as they were last year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from curious eyes for too long, but no one was fooled anymore. They needed to make serious effort to treat me as their son if they wanted to be in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and my sister-in-law, telling her they were tired of her constant whining online. They'd seen her passive-aggressive posts and said my house was not going to become their new home. My sister-in-law reverted to her old routine, crying, throwing a pity party, saying it wasn't fair I had a house when I don't have a family, while she had 4 kids who needed more space. She whined that she just wanted a better place to live to feel like a real mother. Petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she's not even a good mother, since she lets my mom do most of the parenting while she spends her days drinking, scrolling on her phone, or going out spending Dan's money. And she has the nerve to complain. I even joked that I was surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk, given how much alcohol she drinks. That may have been too much. I got some looks for that one. My sister-in-law demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mother. I said the evidence speaks for itself. I told her if she wanted to move out of my parents' house someday, she should use her college degree, get a job, and learn to save money. My mom already raises most of Dan's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time once the baby grows a bit. My brother's oldest, now 7, ran up yelling at me for shouting at his mom. He kept saying she told him I was the mean man who made her cry and wouldn't let them live here. My brother pulled his son away, but then everyone else jumped in. It turned into a full family intervention against my sister-in-law and brother. She was sobbing, the new baby was crying, the kids were crying, hell, even Dan was nearly in tears from the verbal beatdown. He ended up sitting on the shoe bench near the door, looking completely crushed. He couldn't look anyone in the eye or say a word, not with a house full of angry people ready to judge him if he acted like a spoiled brat again. If they hadn't been there, I bet it would have turned into another replay of when he tried to order me around to take my house months earlier. But at that point he was so humiliated that his and my parents' reputations in the family were completely destroyed. The masks were off. Not long after, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left, defeated. The party continued, and we avoided the topic for the rest of the night. Since most of the adults had been drinking, they stayed overnight at my place. Some even slept in my trailer so there was enough room. I admit, it works well as a guest house. My relatives wanted a tour anyway. They said they couldn't believe I'd lived in it for 2 years. I got lots of questions about what it was like in summer and winter, etc. I woke up early on Christmas morning, made a new pot of coffee, and had ibuprofen ready for hangovers. Some relatives had brought chopped eggnog, which was a hit. I got praised for being a much better host than my parents ever were, and everyone agreed to do it again next Christmas. After Christmas, my sister-in-law finally stopped making passive-aggressive posts about me and even deleted her old ones. But shortly after New Year's, she made a new post complaining she tried convincing my parents to buy a trailer like I did so she and Dan could have the whole house. A taste of her own medicine isn't so fun, huh? My parents strongly rejected the idea. No one is going to kick us out of our own house, much less our master bedroom. That post only lasted a few days before she deleted it. Since then, she's barely posted anything at all. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it. I guess she realized complaining is pointless if nobody listens. Things calmed down for me since then. I even invited friends over for a poker night. I'm terrible at poker, I can't remember anything about it, but who cares? We drank beer, ate junk, and goofed off like happy idiots. We stuffed ourselves with Burger King and had a blast the best way 4 grown men can, just having a good time and getting drunk. Maybe in the summer I'll consider dating again. I'm not getting younger. Fingers crossed it works out. My trailer now just sits in my yard, though I admit sometimes I go spend time in it. It was my home for 2 years, after all. It's like a second house. Maybe one day I'll actually use it for camping like it was meant for. I've never camped. My parents thought it was a waste of time, so it would be a new experience. This basically marks the end of what happened. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have kept their distance. They've gone back to acting like I don't exist, like before I bought my house. Doesn't bother me. Better that way. But they'll inevitably be back somehow. I just wonder what stupid thing they'll do next. If anything notable happens again, I'll make another post, as long as this account is still active. My parents and Dan came back sooner than I expected, and this time they wanted money. This won't surprise some people who commented on my previous posts, because my parents did exactly what many of you predicted they'd do, ask for my money or my house. I was expecting the typical narcissist lines about how I owed them or some socialist talk about sharing the wealth. That was just my imagination running wild. The situation that followed was similar, but much milder, I'd say. It looks like they learned not to push me too hard and tried to tug at compassion instead. It started when my parents recently reached out through social media and asked to meet me in a public place of my choosing. That screamed trap, but I wasn't afraid. Honestly, I found it funny. They know better than to provoke me now, so I could only imagine what they wanted. I chose a local restaurant, and we met there. Dan came too but kept his mouth shut most of the time. We had awkward greetings, ordered drinks, and got straight to the point. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently Dan's credit isn't great. Gee, I wonder why. Maybe because his wife ran their finances into the ground. They asked me either to provide some cash or co-sign the lease and help pay the rent. I just said no to both. That's when Dan lost it and yelled that I have a lot and don't have a family to support like he does. He said he needed my help and I should be saving money for his family since I don't have one. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed help. Oh right, they were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go back further, to my childhood? I'd love to discuss that with so many years around. My mom grabbed my hand and begged me not to talk about any of that. My dad and Dan just looked away and said nothing. I'm sure they wanted to say the same old things, but they kept quiet. I asked if they thought I was rich or something, and their faces said it all. When I explained I don't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer in headlights. I laid it out, how much I saved for my down payment, how I had to live and work to save that money so fast, and how I spent almost all of it on the house. I'm still recovering financially. Sure, I have some monthly disposable income, but most of it goes straight into savings. I asked Dan his annual salary. When he told me, I pointed out it's slightly higher than mine. Then I did a rough breakdown in front of my parents. Roughly 70% of my income goes to mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other bills, leaving maybe 30% at most that I can put in savings. I need that money to rebuild a cushion. My truck is from the 90s, if it breaks, I'll need funds to fix or replace it. Houses need emergency funds too, repairs, medical, taxes, lawyers, any unexpected expense that needs quick cash. So, as you can see, I simply can't give Dan money, and I refuse to co-sign anything because that would make me liable for any bill Dan can't, or won't, pay. I also pointed out that's probably why my parents haven't co-signed anything for Dan themselves. My mom started crying again. Basically, I was one step ahead of them on everything. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not stupid, and I told them that directly. I expected my dad to get angry like he always has when I didn't help my brother, but this time he didn't. Not even a grimace. The only way to describe his look was regret and defeat, maybe regret for being a terrible parent, or regret that he can't bully me anymore. Who knows? Either way, they couldn't argue with me, and I wasn't about to hand over cash. Dan stood up and said the whole thing was a waste of time, that he was leaving. My mom started apologizing for him, but he still wanted to go. Just to kill with kindness, I offered to pay for a round of soup and salad while we were there. I guess they couldn't refuse free food, since we hadn't ordered beyond drinks yet. They stayed. I made a point of talking about anything except money. Dan remained quiet, either eating or staring at his phone, but my parents made awkward small talk. They mentioned they'd recently joined a local Christian church and had been going for 2 weeks. I said, good for you. Of course they tried to convince me to go too. I simply said, no thanks, and to their credit, they didn't push it. When the meal ended, Dan left cash on the table for a tip and walked out without another word to me or anyone else. My mom just excused his behavior. We parted ways. That's basically it. Not nearly as dramatic as I thought it would be, but still much better than how things used to be with my parents and brother. As for my sister-in-law, she's been regularly complaining online about my parents. Looks like she doesn't like not being queen of their house, and I think her toxicity is finally getting to them. Why else would they be so desperate to reconnect with me? She really wants my parents to move into a trailer like I did to make space, and she keeps getting a hard no. She seems to have a like-minded little group of followers, because I occasionally get messages from strangers determined to tear into me for not surrendering my house to my sister-in-law. I don't bother arguing anymore, I just block and move on. There's one persistent troll who had my phone number and calls from a different number each time. I'm pretty sure it's the same person who called before, telling me to make way for a real family man like Dan. I don't care. The calls have slowed down, if not stopped entirely, because I made it clear they were just wasting their time. Last call was early this month. Since then, silence. My parents tried to make me give my house to my brother, part 1, later updates. Well, I figured I'd wait half a year after the original posts to update everyone, but it ended up being longer. Yes, things got bad again, but not really for me, mostly. I've been basically fine, if not better, since last Christmas, aside from when my parents and Dan came to ask for money, as I mentioned in my last post, and a more recent confrontation between me and my sister-in-law that you'll read about here. I installed cameras around my house, including a doorbell cam. I didn't tell my family, just as a precaution. So far no one has tried breaking in. I guess the way the police handled things last time scared them enough to leave me alone for the most part. I started renting out 2 bedrooms, one to a close friend and one to that friend's friend. They've been fantastic tenants, quiet, mostly keep to themselves, even have mini fridges so they don't need the main fridge. The rent deal I offered them was pretty good and boosted my monthly income. Even after taxes, I'm putting a decent amount in the bank every month, since the rent covers much of my mortgage. You're probably wondering how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law reacted when I rented those rooms to friends. Answer: not well. My dad and Dan didn't get involved, but my sister-in-law flipped out, which made my mom show up crying, asking why I hadn't rented those rooms to Dan and his family. We argued. I pointed out, among other things, that they broke into my house before to try to steal it. She wouldn't want people who did that living with her either. Also, there's simply not enough room for me, Dan, and his entire family in my house even if I did want to share. It's a 3-bedroom manufactured home. I've got the master with the en-suite bathroom, so that would leave just 2 small rooms for Dan, my sister-in-law, and 4 kids. On top of that, they'd drive me insane. And my current tenants are 2 single guys in their 30s I get along with. My mom had sobbing excuses for a while, but finally admitted she was just desperate. Yes, my parents found out about the rentals because my sister-in-law basically stalked me somehow, then told my parents, then my mom came to cry at my house about it. Since then my parents haven't pestered me about the house, so things are good for me. But for my parents and Dan? Not so much. Turns out my sister-in-law is an even worse person than I thought. I already knew she was manipulative, a professional victim, and drama addicted, but she outdid herself. Dan's youngest kid wasn't his. Yep. You read that right, she had an affair. Looking back, not that surprising, and some of you suspected it months ago. After she was found out, she was kicked out of the family. Dan recently finalized the divorce, which actually turned out favorable for him, since thankfully we live in an at-fault state. Dan also filed to have his name removed from the youngest child's birth certificate, and he won. Basically, after the incident where my parents tried to force me to hand over my house, things got turbulent at their place. My sister-in-law blamed me for a lot. She was convinced I had loads of money, as if I'd won the lottery, and that I should share the wealth. It was her idea that they crash my Christmas party to get back on my good side, and her idea that my parents and Dan tried to squeeze money from me for an apartment. So her bubble burst when Dan and my parents learned the reality of my finances. For a long time she had Dan and my parents completely wrapped up in her toxic mindset, feeding their own narcissism with hers, so her blaming me made them blame me, all the way up to what happened in front of the police when they tried to steal my house. That was the start of her decline. My parents and Dan were hesitant to come to my Christmas party after being exposed like that, but my sister-in-law convinced them to throw together last-minute cheap gifts because, in her mind, I'd never kick them out once they were inside. She was dead wrong. She bet on that plan, and with everyone's blessing, I kicked them out. I think the family reprimand at my party not only destroyed my parents' reputation further, but actually started to open their eyes to stop listening to her. Like I said in my last post, my parents decided to go back to church, maybe because I told them last year they were probably going to hell for their actions. I can't say that's the real reason, but you've got to admit it'd be satisfying if it were. They hadn't gone to church in 2 decades. I don't think it's a bad thing that they're going, they just need to understand church attendance doesn't erase the garbage they did. I have a bit of faith they're trying, because my parents came to apologize to me, without Dan, after seeing an animated video of my first 3 posts. That's right, they've known about this Reddit account for a long time. They know everything I'm saying. No, they're not happy, but everyone here deserves an update, since I'm anonymous. Watching a cartoon version of themselves and their actions was apparently a great way to make them see who they really were. They came to apologize afterward. I'd never seen my dad apologize like that to anyone, he's not a good actor, so it seemed genuine. They fully acknowledged what they did to me and that there's no excuse. They even called themselves narcissists and admitted how much they hurt me. Then they moved to blaming my sister-in-law for a lot. Yeah, they kind of threw her under the bus, but it's not like she wasn't guilty of everything they said. My parents have been in therapy for a while too and offer group family therapy, but I declined. I'm not ready for that anytime soon. Dan himself didn't apologize for a long time, but he looked extremely remorseful whenever the past came up. Meanwhile, his marriage imploded. No, imploded is too gentle. It was a total collapse. Without me as scapegoat/black sheep/ATM they could no longer mock or extort, and after the public humiliation on social media, my Reddit posts, and the animated video, my sister-in-law finally focused all her toxic venom on Dan and my parents. They eventually realized she wasn't who they thought she was. Their denial was strong, but her arrogance was stronger. I've imagined lightsabers clashing over this drama more than once, my sister-in-law dressed like a Sith, with a lipstick-shaped saber. There'd be puns galore, but I never bothered to flesh it out. As you can guess, things got worse. She kept pushing, showing my parents ads for used trailers and motorhomes to convince them to buy one so they could move into it and give her the house. She wouldn't stop, no matter how many times they told her to. She even told them to buy an RV and live on the road like normal old people. That was dumb even for her. My parents counter-suggested that Dan and my sister-in-law buy a trailer and live in it. She basically said she shouldn't have to, because she's the mother. She used the idea that she held parental authority over everyone in the house as an argument, because all the kids were hers. When that didn't work, she literally took her baby and disappeared for days. They knew she was okay because her phone was on and she replied with short, passive-aggressive messages. When she returned, she was even more bitter that no one had caved. She refused to go to church. Dan went with our parents and took the kids, except the youngest, the one she refused to let go anywhere. Personally, I don't go to church. I believe in God and all, but I don't like church. Plus, it never did me any good when I was a kid. My parents tried to make me give my house to my brother. Part 2, How the Affair Came Out. For clarity, most of this information came from Dan and our parents, I'm just relaying what I know. The fan hit max speed when, in March, Dan suddenly accused his wife of cheating. It shocked all of us because we thought he was completely dominated by her, but apparently not anymore. You know how he treats people when he's angry. Well, his wife didn't escape that wrath. He started connecting dots, finally opened his eyes, and secretly did DNA tests for all the kids. 3 of the children were his, but the youngest, the baby, wasn't. For the record, both Dan and I have very dark, almost black, straight hair, same as our parents. My sister-in-law's hair is straight and quite dark too. But the baby's hair is lighter and a bit curly. At first Dan thought it was just because the baby was so young. She minimized and said it would darken over time. It never did. That was the final clue for Dan. He confronted her with the DNA results in front of our parents. She broke down sobbing and admitted it was a mistake. She tried denial, half-truths, and gaslighting, but Dan didn't buy it and dug deeper. I knew he was smart, he just let himself be naive. He had detailed proof, phone logs, messages from her phone, bank statements, and the DNA tests. He even identified the guy, likely the baby's father, who has much lighter, curly hair. The evidence was clear, and Dan said she'd been so bad at hiding the affair that it wasn't hard to find once he started looking. Our parents demanded she leave immediately. She exploded, first with a shouting match, then physical violence. My mom had to call the police. Yes, she was arrested. She scratched Dan and my dad with her long fake nails and even hurt her oldest son, gave him a black eye and bloody nose when he tried to step in. Dan was smart enough to have his phone recording nearby during the confrontation, so the police had everything they needed to arrest her for assault. Her parents had to drive over to post bail. They came back to pick up the baby, her things, and her car. A couple days after she made bail, she showed up at my house. Apparently I was next on her target list. The moment I opened the door, she launched into a rant, accusing me of posting on Reddit, then said I was the plague of her existence. I'm pretty sure she was on something. She seemed especially unhinged, and her eyes didn't look normal. She screamed that mothers with young children are the most sacred thing in the world, then said giving up my house shouldn't have been too much to ask, because supporting family was the least I could have done, and if I had, her family would still be together. When I tried to speak, she actually tried to push me and cover my mouth, hand up like she was ready to scratch me. That didn't go well for her. I'm not the kind of person who tolerates threats. I told her I'd call the police if she didn't take her hands off me immediately, and that everything was being recorded by my door cam. She panicked as soon as I said, camera. I proceeded to verbally demolish her until she backed off my porch. I told her she had some nerve calling me arrogant when she's exactly that. She didn't work for anything she had, cheated on her husband, got pregnant by her lover, had my mom do most of the parenting, spent Dan's money until they were in a financial hole, and acted like she was entitled to my house, so entitled she tried to steal it. I called her arrogant level 1000, said she's a greedy narcissist, told her to stop blaming me for her own actions, and never come back. That was all she needed to hear before she jumped into her car and sped off. That was enough for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report against her for harassment and for the assault she committed against me last year. The fact she laid hands on me at my front door added more to the case. The police have it all on record, and I gave copies of the video to Dan and his divorce lawyer. Yes, I also requested a restraining order. It was granted easily. The woman clearly isn't well. She hasn't posted about me, that I can see, since, probably because her profile is private. Either way, she left me alone. She was still with her lover during the divorce. At the time, I didn't know what kind of man he was, but anyone who sleeps with a married person and has a child with them doesn't have much integrity to begin with. Once the divorce started, she admitted Dan wasn't man enough anymore because he couldn't support the lifestyle she wanted. She genuinely saw herself as trophy wife material who deserved someone rich. Dan said he laughed maniacally, she's nowhere near pretty enough to be a trophy wife, plus all her other faults. She ran off like a child after being told she had to move back with her parents. She was forced to work at her family's business, because Dan cut off her access to his bank accounts. She'd maxed the credit cards he'd given her. She complained about working for her parents despite having a college degree, but they were probably the only ones who would hire her, given her record and a decade-long gap on her resume. I heard from Dan that her parents were disappointed in her, but that may be a rumor, for all I know they're as bad as she is. The real circus began once the divorce was underway. My ex-SAL didn't get much, especially because she had an affair, physically hurt her FIL, husband, and eldest son, and we're in an at-fault state. She basically said goodbye to any chance of a win. I'll get into details in the final post. My ex-SAL saw my Reddit posts and is furious, but there's nothing she can do. Not a surprise that Sarah saw the posts. She can't contact me directly except through a lawyer thanks to the restraining order, and she probably can't afford one now anyway. So she complained to Dan and demanded he tell me to delete my Reddit account. Not only has Dan read my recent posts, he doesn't care anymore. He says they remind him of the jerk he used to be, and he's not losing sleep over it. Plus, I helped him despite everything, so he won't get mad at me over this. My parents also try to treat Dan and me more equally when I'm around, though my dad is still a man of few words with me. Someone pointed out that changing now, after treating me as the opposite of Dan for so long, means he doesn't know how to connect with me anymore, and I think that's right. I don't mind how he is now. My mom has developed a habit of apologizing for anything in my presence. Dan says she and my dad got chewed out by extended family and their therapist, and now my mom feels she must apologize for everything. It's a stark contrast. I didn't mention earlier how Sarah felt about Dan borrowing my trailer so his son could have a room, Sarah's old room. Like a typical bully, she mocked him for it, calling him a bum because he's living in a trailer. Dan took it in stride and asked if she was done. He knew that's exactly how she'd react and simply doesn't care anymore. She's basically dead to him, and her insults fall on deaf ears. He pointed out he's living in the trailer because he's putting his kids ahead of himself, so his son can have his own room, something Sarah never did or would do, despite being their mother. She only used her kids and pregnancies as weapons to avoid working and to manipulate everyone. He asked her how that was working out for her. That was early in the divorce, you can imagine her reaction. Dan says his ex had a real meltdown over my recent posts, but no one bothered to contact me on her behalf to take them down. She'll just have to live with the well-deserved shame. She's tried being nicer to Dan lately, maybe the grass isn't so green living with her parents. Dan tolerates her as the kid's mother when they meet, but that's it. He'll never go back. He says he can't look at her like he used to, and the very idea shuts him down emotionally. So she basically has no chance at reconciliation. No new info on the blonde loudmouth, Sarah's affair partner. His socials are still private, same with hers, and I'll keep it that way. Halloween egging, my truck got egged on Halloween, middle of the night on the 1st. I suspect it was my ex-SIL, but the person my cameras caught wore layered heavy clothes, face covered, and big sunglasses. Couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. They came on foot, so no vehicle ID. The height looked similar to my ex-SAL, but that's not evidence. If it was her, she knew about my cameras, so covering up for a petty egging was probably the smartest thing she's done in years, finally putting her college degree to use by throwing eggs at an old truck. The eggs linger showed up around 3 a.m. I was asleep and heard nothing. Whoever it was quickly pelted about a dozen eggs over the truck and vanished. At least they didn't cause more damage. I saw the mess in the morning, ran it through a car wash on my lunch break, which removed most of it, I scrubbed the rest later. Egg is bad for paint, but the truck's from the 90s and not exactly showroom condition. I took photos and filed a police report with the footage as evidence. Nothing's come of it, no real damage besides mild irritation and some wash costs. If it was my ex-SIL, she was smart enough to stick to eggs, no keying or slashed tires, so insurance didn't get involved. The cops treated it like a likely teen prank. I get they're busy, but at least the report exists in case something happens again. I waited to post to see if anything else would happen. Everything went quiet. I asked neighbors about any cameras that might have caught the person. Answers ranged from, "We don't have cameras," to, "It was Halloween, let it go." A few helpful folks said I waited too long and their footage auto-deleted. So the perp got away. If it was my ex-SIL, she likely walked half a kilometer in those layers so no car would be identified. Wouldn't surprise me if she wondered whether it was worth it. Whatever. I'll see if they return next year. I printed photos of the egg slinger and handed them out, even posted a few flyers so neighbors are aware. My tenants didn't get involved, and I don't blame them. Not their problem. Trailer returned, ex-SIL got a DUI, a copycat video stirred up the family again. First, when I came back after all this time, I found 500 messages in my inbox and 130 message requests. Please don't DM me anymore, it's too many to answer. If you messaged and I hit ignore, I'm sorry, that's why. It wasn't personal. I felt overwhelmed. That's not why I returned to Reddit, though. I decided to stay away for at least a year because my posts weren't exactly helping family morale. But the other day Dan saw a video very similar to mine, a male OP with a sister instead of a sister-in-law, but with many similarities: narcissistic parents, arrogant golden child, the scapegoat brother homeless, the golden child favoritism hidden from the extended family, sister in her 20s with 3 kids and pregnant with a 4th, the sister's oldest attacking the OP, and above all trying to steal the OP's house by breaking in while he wasn't home. Many parts were nearly identical, down to phrases like, "Just get over it," and, "My house isn't free to be taken." My parents and Dan are frankly annoyed, and I wasn't happy either. We've been trying to move on from our old dynamic and what my ex-SIL put us through. You can imagine it was hard for me to let go of resentment, but in a year my parents and Dan improved more than I'd seen in my entire life before that, and I love my nieces and nephew too much. So, whoever copied my story, congrats, you just sent my family back to therapy. And yes, my family knows I'm making this post now. With that rant out of the way, here's what I hope is my last update. Dan kept his word, my trailer was returned a few months ago, in good condition. He took good care of it and cleaned it thoroughly before returning it. He and our dad even redid the roof while it was under their care. Inside it's as good as when I lived in it, now smelling like pine cleaner. There was a bit of drama while Dan was living in my trailer with a neighbor behind them. Not sure she qualifies as a Karen, but close. She yelled over the fence about the trailer and threatened to call the police. Dan and our dad argued a bit, then explained he was living there so his son could have his room. She still wasn't happy but stopped the threats. My dad spoke to her husband later, he was furious with her, apologized, and said Dan was doing a good thing by giving his son the bedroom. He also congratulated Dan for kicking out my ex-SIL and said he'd always been afraid to mention it before, but she was just nasty. We all agreed. So, no more neighbor problem. Dan and our dad pooled money and bought a slightly larger trailer to place in my parents' yard. We only needed my truck to move it. That's the best Dan can do right now until he pays off the credit debt his ex racked up, and even then, he's got 2 daughters' futures to plan for. He might be living in that trailer for the next 10 years, but it's better than when he was married. His ex certainly can't, and won't, contribute to the kids' college funds, except maybe for the last one, the admitted baby. Dan's trailer is nicer than mine, newer, larger, with its own bathroom. He barely uses it, it's basically a closet because the toilet/shower are tiny. If he needs a bathroom, he goes into the house. We joked that I'm jealous he has the better guest house, and we talked like sarcastic gentlemen about it. He equipped it with a flat screen for streaming, video games, and a DVD player. He says it finally feels like he has his own space, even if it's just in the backyard. He's much happier divorced now. He says he'll buy a pickup one day so he can move the trailer himself, but for now he keeps the minivan for the kids. So his trailer stays put, and mine is back in my yard where it belongs, though it hasn't sat idle. I temporarily rented it to a cousin who moved to the area for work. He stayed about a month before finding an apartment. It's also a handy guest suite when needed. My nephew has come a few times to hang out, his sisters aren't that interested. The trailer is the closest he's ever been to camping. Sadly, same for me, I bought it to live in, not camp. My parents have stuck with therapy. My mom is medicated for mental health issues and fully acknowledges the terrible favoritism of the past, same for my dad. He's still a bit weird around me, but he's active in church and trying hard to rebuild the family's reputation. Dan cut way back on drinking now that he's less stressed, he even started working out, he's in good shape now. He said his ex saw a photo he posted after losing 45 pounds and called to compliment him. He didn't fall for it. Holidays, my parents, brother, and the kids all came to my Christmas Eve party last year, along with most of the relatives from the year before. No issues, aside from no one being able to crash in my spare room since I rent them out. Both tenants were out visiting their families anyway. Everything went really well. Not only was my ex-SAL not invited, she couldn't have ruined it anyway due to my restraining order. She's barely made any effort to see the kids, maybe twice a month at most. She hasn't sent presents for birthdays or Christmas since being exposed as a cheater. The kids were upset at first, but now they just don't care. My ex-SIL decided to live like she's single again despite having a baby at home, and life slapped her hard. New Year's Eve.
Commentary Reddit Observer. What a ride. This whole saga shows how entitlement can grow when boundaries are never set, and how fast that house of cards collapses once someone finally says, no. The op didn't just protect a deed, he protected his peace. And when the truth about the affair came out, we saw the difference between family that learns and takes accountability, and people who only show up when there's something to take. It's messy, it's human, but there's a real lesson here. Document everything, keep receipts, and don't let guilt be used as a weapon. Helping kids is noble, enabling adults is not. If this story kept you hooked, tell me, what would you have done differently? Drop your take in the comments, I read them all. If you enjoyed the video, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next wild update. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.